The massive ship called Dominion's Edge moved through the dark space between stars. It was bigger than any city on Earth, with thousands of rooms and corridors that stretched for miles. The ship belonged to Supreme Overlord Zethruck, the most powerful ruler in the Korthani Empire. His word was law across hundreds of worlds, and his fleet could destroy entire planets. Katie Morgan crawled through a narrow, metal tunnel deep inside the ship's belly. She was only 11 years old, but her small hands worked quickly to fix a broken wire. The tunnel was so small that only a child could fit inside it. The air was hot and thick, making it hard to breathe. Katie had been doing this kind of work for 3 years. Ever since the Korthani soldiers took her from her home, she remembered that terrible day when the alien ships came to her colony world. The sky had turned red with fire, and the ground shook with explosions. Her parents had hidden her in the basement, but the soldiers found her anyway. They took all the children who were young enough to be useful slaves. Katie never saw her parents. Again, the Korthani were tall creatures with gray skin and 4 arms. They looked like giant insects walking on 2 legs. Their voices made clicking sounds when they talked, and their black eyes showed no kindness. They had conquered hundreds of worlds and taken millions of slaves. Humans were just one more species to serve them. Katie finished fixing the wire and crawled backward through the tunnel. Her knees hurt from the hard metal floor, and her clothes were dirty with grease and dust. When she reached the maintenance room, she saw Vex waiting for her. He was her handler, a Korthani officer who made sure she did her work. "Is it fixed, human?" Vex asked in his clicking voice. He always called her human instead of using her name. "Yes, sir," Katie said quietly. She had learned to keep her voice low and her eyes down. Slaves who spoke too loudly or looked directly at their masters were punished. "Good, there are more repairs needed in Section 12. Go there now." Vex turned and walked away without another word. Katie picked up her small toolbox and headed toward Section 12. The corridors of the ship were huge, with high ceilings and walls made of dark metal. Strange lights cast purple shadows everywhere. Katie had walked these halls so many times that she knew every turn and corner. Other slaves moved through the corridors, all keeping their heads down and walking quickly. There were humans like Katie, but also creatures from other conquered worlds. Some had fur, others had scales, and a few looked almost like trees walking on roots. They all had the same look in their eyes, the empty stare of people who had given up hope. Katie was different. She still remembered what it felt like to be free. She still asked questions in her mind, even when she couldn't ask them out loud. While other slaves just did their work and tried not to think, Katie watched and learned. She had started to understand the Korthani language by listening to the engineers talk. She could read some of their writing by watching them work with computer screens. The other slaves thought she was crazy for wanting to learn, but Katie couldn't help herself. Learning made her feel alive. In Section 12, Katie found the broken power junction that needed repair. It was behind a panel that only her small hands could reach. As she worked, she listened to 2 Korthani engineers talking nearby. "The power readings are wrong again," one of them said. "The bridge display shows normal levels, but the actual output is dropping." "It's been happening for weeks," the other replied. "But the senior engineers say it's just a minor glitch. They're too busy preparing for the battle to worry about small problems." Katie's hands stopped moving. She had noticed the same thing during her work in the tunnels. The power cables were getting hot in places where they should be cool. The energy flow was uneven, like water trying to flow through a pipe with holes in it. But she had thought it was normal. After all, she was just a child slave. What did she know about running a warship? But now she realized the engineers were worried too. This wasn't normal at all. Something was wrong with the ship's power system. And it was getting worse. Katie finished her repair and crawled back to the maintenance room. Vex was gone, so she was alone. She looked at the computer screen that showed the ship's basic systems. She had learned to read the Korthani numbers and symbols by watching the engineers work. The screen showed that everything was normal, but Katie knew that wasn't true. She had been in the tunnels where the real power flowed. She had felt the heat and seen the sparks. The computer was lying or someone was making it lie. She thought about telling Vex what she had discovered. But what would happen? A human slave child telling Corthony engineers that their computers were wrong? They would probably punish her for speaking without permission. They might even send her to the punishment cells where slaves were hurt as examples to others. Katie decided to keep quiet. She would watch and learn more before saying anything. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe the engineers knew about the problem and were fixing it. Maybe it wasn't as serious as it seemed, but deep in her heart, Katie knew something bad was going to happen. The ship was sick, and nobody wanted to admit it. The Corthony were so proud of their technology that they couldn't believe anything could go wrong. They thought their ships were perfect, their weapons were the best, and their empire would last forever. Katie had learned that pride could be dangerous. Her father had told her that before the invasion, he had been an engineer too, working on the colony's power systems. He always said that the most dangerous mistake was thinking you knew everything. Always check your work twice, Katie, he had said, and never be too proud to admit when something is wrong. Pride can kill you faster than any enemy. Katie missed her father? She wondered if he was still alive somewhere, or if the Corthony had killed him like they killed so many others. She hoped he would be proud of her for learning so much about the ship's systems. Even as a slave, she was still his daughter. The next day brought more repairs and more opportunities to listen. Katie learned that the ship was heading toward a big battle. The Corthony were going to fight against rebels who wanted to be free from the Empire. The crew was excited because they thought it would be an easy victory, but Katie remembered what her father had taught her about electrical systems. When power flow was uneven, it meant the system was weak. And when a system was weak, it could fail at the worst possible moment. As she crawled through the tunnels that day, Katie made a decision. She would keep watching and learning. She would map out the power problems in her mind. And if something terrible happened, maybe she could help. She didn't know why she wanted to help the ship that had taken her from her family. Maybe it was because there were other slaves aboard who didn't deserve to die. Maybe it was because some of the younger Corthony officers had been kind to her. Or maybe it was just because helping others was the right thing to do, even when those others were your enemies. Katie finished her work and crawled back through the tunnel. Tomorrow would bring more repairs, more listening, and more learning. She was just a small human child in a vast alien ship, but she was starting to understand that sometimes the smallest person could make the biggest difference. The Dominion's Edge moved faster through space as Supreme Overlord Zethric pushed his fleet toward the Nexus sector. Katie could feel the ship's engines working harder. The vibrations in the walls were stronger, and the air recycling systems made more noise. Everything on the ship was preparing for war. Katie crawled through her usual tunnels, but now she saw things that worried her more each day. The power cables were getting hotter. Some of them glowed with a dull red light that shouldn't be there. The energy readings on the small displays in the tunnel showed numbers that kept changing when they should stay. The same dot she had started keeping track of the problems in her mind. There were 17 major power junctions that ran too hot. 23 cable connections that sparked when they shouldn't. And the main power flow to the ship's defensive shields was dropping by small amounts every day. Katie knew this was serious, but she didn't know what to do about it. She was just a slave child who fixed small problems in places too narrow for adults to reach. Nobody would listen to her about big technical issues that could affect the whole ship. In the engineering sections, Katie heard the crew talking more about the coming battle. The Corthony were excited because they thought it would be easy. They had bigger ships, better weapons, and more soldiers than the rebels. The rebels were just a group of different species who wanted to be free from Corthony rule. The rebels are weak, she heard one engineer say to another. They have old ships and basic weapons. We'll destroy them in a few hours. Yes, his partner agreed. Our shields are too strong for their weapons to hurt us, and our guns can break. Their ships like glass. Katie wanted to tell them that the shields might not work properly. She had seen the power systems that fed energy to the defensive barriers. Those systems were getting weaker every day. But she stayed quiet and kept working. Supreme Overlord Zethrak visited the engineering deck that day. Katie saw him through a grate in the wall while she was working inside a tunnel. He was huge, even for a Corthony, with 4 powerful arms and armor that gleamed like black metal. His voice was deep and commanding, and everyone moved faster when he spoke. "Report on the ship's condition," Zethrak ordered the chief engineer. "All systems are running perfectly, Supreme Overlord," the engineer replied. "The ship is ready for battle. Our weapons are fully charged, and our shields are at maximum strength." Katie knew the engineer was wrong, but she couldn't say anything. She watched through the grate as Zethrak nodded and walked away. He trusted his engineers completely. He believed his ship was invincible. After Zethrak left, Katie heard the engineers talking quietly among themselves. They were worried about something, but they didn't want to admit it to their leader. "The power fluctuations are getting worse," one of them whispered. "The shield generators are showing stress patterns I've never seen before." "Should we report it?" another asked. "No," the chief engineer said firmly. "It's probably just normal variations. We can't bother the Supreme Overlord with small technical problems right before a major battle. He needs to focus on strategy, not minor system glitches." Katie realized that the engineers were scared. They knew something was wrong, but they were too afraid to tell their leader. In the Corthony Empire, bringing bad news to a superior could result in severe punishment or even death. That night, Katie lay on her small sleeping mat in the slave quarters. Around her, hundreds of other slaves slept on similar mats arranged in long rows. The room was dark and smelled of too many people living too close together. Katie listened to the sounds of the ship, the humming of engines, the whisper of air systems, and the distant footsteps of guards in the corridors. She thought about her discovery and what it might mean. If the ship's shields failed during battle, everyone aboard would die. That included not just the Corthony crew, but also all the slaves. Children like her who had done nothing wrong would die because the engineers were too scared to tell the truth. Katie made a decision. She would learn more about the ship's systems. She would figure out exactly what was wrong and how bad it really was. Maybe she could find a way to fix it herself, or maybe she would find the courage to speak up when the time came. Over the next few days, Katie used her access to the tunnels to explore parts of the ship she had never seen before. She followed power cables to their sources and mapped out the electrical systems in her mind. She discovered that the problems were much worse than she had first thought. The ship's main power core was old and had been pushed too hard for too long. The connections that carried energy to the shields were corroded and weak. The backup systems that should take over if the main systems failed were also damaged. It was like a house with a weak foundation and broken support beams, but with a fresh coat of paint to hide the problems. Katie learned that the rebels had been developing new weapons. She overheard intelligence officers talking about something called quantum disruptors. These weapons were designed to find weak points in energy shields and attack them directly. They were like arrows that could find the smallest crack in armor and split it wide open. The Corthony officers weren't worried about these new weapons because they believed their shields were too strong to be broken. But Katie knew the truth. The shields had exactly the kind of weak points that quantum disruptors were designed to exploit. One day, while Katie was working near the main command center, she heard Supreme Overlord Zethrak talking to his battle commanders. His voice carried through the ventilation system into the tunnel where she was working. "The rebels have gathered their entire fleet in the Nexus sector," Zethrak said. "This is their last stand. When we destroy them, the rebellion will be finished. Forever. What about their new weapons, Supreme Overlord?" one of the commanders asked. "Their quantum disruptors are untested technology," Zethrak replied with confidence. "Our shields have protected us for 100 years. No rebel weapon can break through Corthony defenses." Katie wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them that the shields were failing, that the ship was in danger, that everyone aboard might die. But she was just a child slave in a tunnel. Even if she could get their attention, they would never believe her. As the ship got closer to the battle zone, Katie noticed that the power problems were getting worse faster. The systems were breaking. down under the stress of high-speed travel and battle preparations. She saw sparks flying from connections that should have been stable. She felt heat coming from cables that should have been cool. The other slaves sensed that something was wrong too. They whispered among themselves about strange noises in the walls and flickering lights in the corridors. Some of the older slaves, who had been aboard longer, said the ship felt different, like it was sick. Katie knew they were right. The ship was sick, and it was getting sicker every day. The Korthani were so proud of their technology that they couldn't see what was happening right in front of them. They trusted their computers and their engineers, but they didn't trust their own eyes and ears. In 2 days, they would reach the Nexus sector. The battle would begin, and the rebels would use their quantum disruptors against the Korthani shields. Katie knew what would happen when those weapons hit the weak points in the ship's defenses. The shields would fail, and the ship would be destroyed, unless someone did something to fix the problems first. Katie was starting to think that someone might have to be her. The Dominion's edge dropped out of faster-than-light travel with a shudder that Katie felt through the metal walls. She was in Maintenance Tunnel 7 when it happened, fixing a water recycling unit that had been making strange noises. The sudden stop threw her against the tunnel wall, as she heard alarms beginning to sound throughout the ship, battle stations. The fight was about to begin. Katie crawled quickly through the tunnel toward a viewing port she had discovered weeks ago. It was a small window that looked out into space, hidden behind a maintenance panel where no one would think to look. She had to see what was happening. When she reached the window, Katie gasped at what she saw. The Nexus sector was full of ships. Hundreds of rebel vessels floated in the darkness, waiting for the Korthani fleet to arrive. They were smaller than the Korthani ships, and many of them looked old and patched together. But there were so many of them, like a swarm of angry insects ready to attack. The Korthani fleet spread out into battle formation. Katie could see dozens of massive warships, each one bristling with weapons and protected by energy shields that glowed with a faint blue light. The Dominion's Edge was the largest ship of all, positioned at the center of the formation like a queen surrounded by her warriors. Through the ship's communication system, Katie heard Supreme Overlord Zethrak's voice speaking to his fleet. "Today, we end this rebellion forever," he announced. "These weak creatures dare to challenge the might of the Korthani Empire. We will show them the price of defying us. All ships begin the attack." The battle started exactly as the Korthani had planned. Their big guns fired streams of energy that cut through space like deadly lightning. The first wave of rebel ships exploded in brilliant flashes of light. Katie watched in horror as hundreds of beings died in seconds, but the rebels didn't run away. More ships moved forward to replace the ones that had been destroyed. They fired their own weapons, but the energy beams bounced harmlessly off the Korthani shields. The blue barriers around each ship absorbed the attacks like they were nothing more than raindrops. Katie crawled through the tunnels to different viewing ports, watching the battle unfold. The Korthani were winning easily, just as they had expected. Their shields were holding perfectly, and their weapons were cutting through the rebel fleet like a hot knife through butter. But Katie knew this was just the beginning. The rebels hadn't used their new weapons yet. They were letting the Korthani get confident, making them think the battle was already won. After 30 minutes of fighting, something changed. The rebel ships began to move differently, forming new patterns in space. Katie saw strange-looking weapons appearing on their hulls, devices that looked different from normal energy cannons. These had to be the quantum disruptors. The first disruptor beam hit a Korthani battleship on the fleet's right flank. Instead of bouncing off the shields like other weapons, this beam seemed to sink into the energy barrier. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the entire shield system around the battleship flickered and went dark. Without its shields, the battleship was helpless. Rebel weapons tore through its hull like paper. The ship exploded in a massive fireball that lit up the space around. Katie felt the Dominion's edge shake as the explosion sent shockwaves through the battle zone. On the bridge, she could hear officers shouting in confusion and fear. They couldn't understand how their shields had failed so completely. More Disruptor beams lanced out from the rebel ships. Each one found its target and somehow broke through the Korthani shields. One by one, the great warships began to die. The Korthani fleet, which had seemed invincible just minutes before, was suddenly in serious trouble. Supreme Overlord Zethrak's voice came over the communication system again, but now it was filled with anger instead of confidence. "All ships, pull back to defensive positions," he ordered. "Activate secondary shield generators. Find out how they're breaking through our defenses." But Katie knew the secondary generators wouldn't help. She had seen those systems in her tunnel work. They were just as weak as the primary shields, maybe even weaker. The quantum disruptors would break through them just as easily. The battle turned into chaos. Korthani ships tried to retreat while rebel vessels pressed their attack. The space around the Nexus sector filled with wreckage and explosions. Katie watched through her hidden window as proud warships died one after another. Then she felt it. The Dominion's edge began to shake in a way that was different from the battle vibrations. Katie had spent years in the ship's tunnels, and she knew every sound and feeling the vessel could make. This was new. This was wrong. The power systems were failing. Katie abandoned her viewing port and crawled as fast as she could through the tunnels toward the main engineering section. She had to know how bad it was. The shaking got worse as she moved, and she could hear new alarms joining the battle warnings. When she reached the engineering tunnels, Katie saw her worst fears coming true. The power cables were glowing red hot, much hotter than they should ever be. Sparks flew from connections that couldn't handle the stress. The ship's desperate attempts to maintain shields under quantum disruptor attack were pushing the already weak systems beyond their limits. Through a grate in the tunnel wall, Katie could see the main engineering deck. Korthani engineers ran back and forth trying to understand what was happening to their ship. Computer screens showed error messages in the alien script that Katie had learned to read. "Power levels dropping in sections 12 through 27, one engineer reported. "Shield generators are overheating," another called out. "We're losing defensive capability." "Impossible," the chief engineer replied. "Run a full diagnostic." There must be an error in the sensors, but Katie knew there was no error. She had seen this coming for weeks. The ship's power systems were finally collapsing under the strain of battle. The quantum disruptors hadn't even hit the Dominion's edge yet, but the ship was already starting to fail. A massive explosion somewhere in the distance sent shockwaves through the hull. Katie felt the tunnel around her twist and bend. More alarms began to sound and the lights flickered. Emergency power systems kicked in, but Katie knew they wouldn't last long either. She crawled toward the main power coupling chamber, the heart of the ship's electrical system. If she was right, that's where the real problems would show first. The tunnel was getting hotter as she moved, and she could smell the sharp odor of burning metal. When Katie reached the chamber, she saw something that made her heart sink. The main power coupling was surrounded by a web of cables that glowed like the sun. The metal around the connections was starting to melt. If this system failed, the entire ship would lose power. No lights, no air, no gravity, no shields. Everyone aboard would die. Through the chamber's observation window, Katie could see the battle still raging outside. The rebel ships were getting closer, and she could see the strange blue glow of quantum disruptor weapons charging up. They were about to fire at the Dominion's edge. The ship's shields were already failing from internal power problems. When the disruptors hit, they would find a defense system that was barely working. The attack would punch through the weakened shields like they weren't even there. Katie realized that in just minutes, maybe less, the flagship of the Korthani Empire would be destroyed. Supreme Overlord Zethrak, his crew, and thousands of slaves would all die together. The rebellion would win their greatest victory by destroying the ship that had terrorized the galaxy for decades. But Katie didn't feel happy about it, she thought. About all the other slaves aboard who had never hurt anyone. She thought about the younger Korthani officers who had sometimes been kind to her. She even thought about the engineers who were trying so hard to save their ship, even though they didn't understand what was really wrong. The tunnel around her grew hotter. The power coupling was about to fail completely. In the distance, Katie could see the blue glow of disruptor weapons getting brighter. She was the only person on the ship who truly understood what was happening. She was the only one who knew how to fix it, and she was just an 11-year-old slave girl who nobody would listen to, but maybe that didn't matter. Maybe she could fix it herself. Katie stared at the glowing power coupling through the observation window. The metal was getting so hot that it was starting to change color from silver to red to white. She could hear the electrical system screaming under the strain, making sounds like angry animals trapped in cages. She had maybe 5 minutes before everything failed completely. Maybe less. Through the ship's hull, Katie could feel the vibrations of the quantum disruptor weapons charging up. The rebel ships were preparing to fire their final attack. When those beams hit the Dominion's edge, they would find shields that were barely working and power systems that were about to collapse. The ship would die, and everyone on it would die too. Katie thought about her parents. They had died when the Corthony invaded her world. The aliens had taken everything from her, her home, her family, her freedom. She had every reason to hate them. She had every reason to let their flagship burn, but she also thought about the other slaves aboard the ship. There were thousands of them from dozens of different worlds. Children younger than her who had been stolen from their families. Old people who had been worked nearly to death. None of them had chosen to be here. They didn't deserve to die just because they happened to be on the wrong ship. Katie thought about some of the Corthony too. Not all of them were cruel. There was a young engineer named Crix who had once given her extra food when she was sick. There was a maintenance supervisor who had protected her from a brutal guard. Even some of the soldiers had shown small kindnesses. When their officers weren't watching, were they her enemies? Yes, but did that mean they deserved to die? Katie's father had always told her that doing the right thing wasn't about who deserved what. It was about what kind of person you chose to be. Even when people hurt you, even when they took everything from you, you still had to choose between helping and letting others suffer. Another explosion shook the ship. Katie could hear the sound of metal tearing somewhere in the distance. The power coupling was getting hotter, and she could see cracks starting to form in the metal around the connections. She made her decision. Katie crawled backward through the tunnel as fast as she could move. The metal around her was getting so hot that it burned her hands and knees, but she pushed through the pain. She had to reach the maintenance access point. That led to the power coupling chamber. The access point was a small hatch that led directly into the chamber where the main power coupling was located. Katie had seen it during her earlier explorations, but she had never gone through it. It was marked with warning signs and Corthony writing that told people to stay away from the dangerous electrical equipment inside. Katie reached the hatch and tried to open it. The metal handle was so hot that it burned her palm, but she gritted her teeth and turned it anyway. The hatch swung open, and a wave of heat washed over her that was like opening the door to a furnace. Inside the chamber, Katie could see the power coupling surrounded by a maze of cables and connections. The whole room was filled with electrical fire. Not real flames, but arcs of energy that jumped between the overloaded components. The air itself seemed to glow with dangerous power. Katie knew that if she went into that room, she might die. The electrical energy could stop her heart or burn her to death. Even if she survived, she would probably be badly hurt, but if she didn't go in, everyone on the ship would definitely die. Katie crawled through the hatch into the chamber. The heat hit her like a physical blow, and the air was so thick with electrical energy that her hair stood up and her skin tingled. She could taste metal in her mouth and her eyes watered from the bright light of the electrical arcs. The power coupling was a massive device in the center of the room, surrounded by hundreds of cables that carried energy to different parts of the ship. Katie could see the problem immediately. The main connections were loose and the electrical current was jumping across the gaps. This created heat and waste, which made the whole system unstable. During her years of tunnel work, Katie had learned to fix loose connections, but she had never worked with anything this big or this dangerous. The power flowing through these cables could run an entire city. One mistake would kill her instantly. Katie looked around the chamber for the tools she would need. There was an emergency repair kit mounted on the wall, but it was on the other side of the room. She would have to crawl across the floor while electrical fire danced overhead. She started moving. The floor was so hot that it burned through her thin slave clothing, but she kept going. Above her, arcs of energy crackled and sparked, sometimes coming so close that she could feel them pulling at her hair. Katie reached the toolkit and opened it. Inside were the heavy gloves and insulated tools that engineers used to work on electrical systems. She put on the gloves even though they were much too big for her hands. They would protect her from the worst of the electrical energy. Now came the hard part. Katie had to reach the loose connections and tighten them while the system was still running. There was no way to shut off the power without killing everyone on the ship immediately. She would have to work on live electrical systems that could kill her with a single touch. Katie crawled back toward the power coupling. The electrical arcs were getting worse as the system became more unstable. She could hear the metal connections grinding against each other as they expanded and contracted from the heat. She reached the first loose connection. It was a massive cable junction that connected the main power flow to the ship's shield generators. The connection was so hot that she could see it glowing even through her protective gloves. Katie grabbed the connection with both hands and tried to tighten it. The metal was so hot that she could feel it burning through the gloves, but she held on. The connection was heavier than she expected, and it took all her strength to turn it. Slowly, gradually the connection began to tighten. As it did, the electrical arcing around it decreased. The system was stabilizing, but Katie knew this was just the beginning. There were dozens of other loose connections that needed to be fixed. She moved to the next connection, and the next. Each one was as difficult as the first. The heat was getting worse, and Katie could feel her strength fading. The protective gloves were starting to fall apart from the electrical energy and extreme heat. While she worked, Katie could hear the battle continuing outside. The ship shook with each explosion, and the lights flickered as power systems struggled to keep working. She knew that the quantum disruptors were getting closer to firing their final attack. Katie reached the most important connection of all, the one that controlled power flow to the main shield generators. This connection was larger than the others, and it was also the most damaged. The metal around it had melted and reformed several times, creating a twisted mess that barely held together. This was the connection that would determine whether the ship lived or died. If Katie could fix it, the shields might hold long enough for the ship to survive the quantum disruptor attack. If she couldn't, or if she made a mistake, the ship would be destroyed. Katie grabbed the connection with both hands. It was so hot that she could smell her gloves burning, but she held on. The connection was stuck, fused together by heat and electrical energy. She pulled and twisted, using every bit of strength she had left. Something gave way. The connection moved, just a little. Katie kept working, ignoring the pain in her hands and the heat that was making it hard to breathe. Slowly, gradually, the connection began to turn. Above her, the electrical arcing began to decrease. The power flow was stabilizing. The ship's shields were getting stronger. Katie had done it. She had fixed the main power coupling. The ship would survive. The moment Katie fixed the final connection, she felt the ship change around her. The electrical arcing stopped, and the dangerous humming sound that had filled the chamber for weeks finally went quiet. The power coupling glowed with a steady, healthy light instead of the angry red fire it had shown before. Through the ship's hull, Katie could feel the shields coming back to full strength. The blue energy barriers that protected the Dominions' edge grew brighter and stronger. Just in time, the quantum disruptor beams hit the ship. 3 seconds later, Katie felt the impact through the metal floor. The ship shook like it had been struck by a giant hammer, but the shields held. Instead of punching through weak defenses and destroying the vessel, the disruptor beams scattered harmlessly across the energy barriers, the rebel weapons that had been destroying Corthony ships all day could not break through the Dominions. Edge.KT collapsed on the chamber floor, exhausted and burned. Her hands were badly hurt from the hot metal, and her clothes were singed from the electrical energy. But she was alive, and so was everyone else on the ship. Through the ship's communication system, she heard Supreme Overlord Zethrak's voicing with renewed confidence. All ships, the flagship shields are holding, he announced. Form up. On the Dominion's edge, we counterattack now? The battle turned again. With their most powerful ship leading the charge, the Korthani fleet rallied. The rebels had used most of their quantum disruptors trying to destroy the flagship. Now they faced angry Korthani forces with working shields and nothing left to break. Through them, the rebel fleet began to retreat, but it was too late. The Korthani ships surrounded them and began the final destruction. Katie watched through the chamber's small window. As the last of the rebel vessels exploded in brilliant flashes of light, the rebellion was over. The Korthani Empire had won. Katie crawled out of the power coupling chamber and back into the maintenance tunnels. She was hurt and tired, but she had to get away before someone found her in a place where slaves weren't supposed to be. She moved slowly through the tunnels, trying to make it back to her normal work area. She didn't make it. Chief Engineer Vex found her in Tunnel 12, unconscious from pain and exhaustion. Her burned hands and singed clothing told a story that even he could understand. When the engineering crew investigated, they discovered what she had done in the power coupling chamber. Katie woke up in the ship's medical bay, something that had never happened to a slave before. Her hands were wrapped in healing bandages, and she lay on a real bed instead of a sleeping mat on the floor. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Then she saw Supreme Overlord Zethrak standing beside her bed. Katie tried to sit up, but her body was too weak. She had never been this close to the ruler of the Korthani Empire before. He was even more frightening in person than she had imagined. His forearms were thick with muscle, and his black eyes seemed to look right through her. So, Zethrak said in his deep, clicking voice, "You are the little human who saved my ship." Katie didn't know what to say. She had expected to be punished for leaving her assigned work area. She had expected to be sent to the punishment cells or maybe even killed for interfering with ship systems without permission. "The engineers tell me that our power coupling was failing," Zethrak continued. "They say it would have collapsed during the battle if someone had not repaired it. They also tell me that the repair was done by hand in a chamber full of deadly electrical energy." Katie found her voice. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "Why?" Zethrak asked. "Why did you risk your life to save a ship full of people who have enslaved you? Why did you help the empire that destroyed your world and killed your family?" Katie thought about the question. It was the same question she had asked herself in the tunnel before making her choice. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said finally. "My father taught me that you help people when they need help, even if they are your enemies. There were innocent people on this ship who would have died if I did nothing." Zethrak stared at her for a long moment. Katie couldn't tell what he was thinking. His alien face showed no expression that she could understand. "Interesting," he said. "At last, you chose to save lives instead of seeking revenge. You chose compassion over hatred. You chose to protect others even when it gave you no advantage." Zethrak turned to the chief engineer who was standing nearby. "Show me the repair she made." The engineer activated a wall screen that showed the power coupling chamber. Katie could see the connections she had fixed, now glowing with steady, healthy light. "The repair work is perfect," the engineer reported. "Better than perfect, actually. She somehow managed to fix problems that our diagnostic systems couldn't even detect. The power flow is more stable now than it has been in years." "How is that possible?" Zethrak asked. "She had been observing the systems for months," the engineer explained. "She noticed problems that we missed because we trusted our computers more than our eyes. She learned to read our language and understand our technology just by watching and listening." Zethrak looked back at Katie. "You learned Korthani engineering by observation alone?" "Yes, sir," Katie said. "I wanted to understand how things worked." "Remarkable," Zethrak said. "Intelligence, curiosity, technical skill, and moral courage. These are qualities I value highly, regardless of what species displays them." Zethrak was quiet for another moment, thinking. When he spoke again, his words changed Katie's life forever. "I hereby grant you your freedom," he announced. "You are no longer a slave. You are now a citizen of the Korthani Empire with all the rights and protections that status provides." Katie couldn't believe what she was hearing. Freedom? After 3 years of slavery, she was going to be free. "Furthermore," Zethric continued, "I offer you a position as a junior engineer aboard this ship. You will receive proper training and education. If you prove yourself worthy, you may advance to higher positions within the Imperial Engineering Corps." "I don't understand," Katie said. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you have shown me something I had forgotten," Zethric replied. "You have shown me that true strength comes not from weapons or fear, but from choosing to do what is right even when it is difficult. My empire needs more people like you." Zethric turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at Katie. "Your actions today saved not just this ship, but thousands of lives," he said. "You have earned the respect of every being aboard this vessel. Use that respect wisely." After Zethric left, Katie lay in the medical bed trying to understand what had happened. She was free. She had a job. She would be trained as an engineer, just like her father had been. Over the following days, Katie discovered that her new status came with real changes. She had her own small room instead of sleeping in the slave quarters. She ate the same food as the crew instead of the basic rations given to slaves. Most importantly, she was treated with respect by beings who had once seen her as nothing more than property. The other slaves looked at her with a mixture of hope and amazement. For the first time in years, they had seen one of their own earn freedom through their actions instead of simply enduring until death. Katie's example showed them that it was possible to rise above their circumstances. The Korthani crew also treated her differently. They had seen what she could do with her intelligence and courage. They had learned that humans could be more than just laborers and servants. Some of them began to question whether slavery was really necessary for the Empire's success. Katie threw herself into her engineering studies with the same determination she had shown in the power coupling chamber. She learned quickly and asked questions that surprised her teachers. Within months, she was solving problems that had puzzled experienced engineers for years, but Katie never forgot where she came from or the people she had left behind in the slave quarters. She used her new position to help other slaves whenever she could, and she worked to prove that humans deserved to be treated as equals rather than property. Years later, Katie would become one of the most respected engineers in the Korthani fleet. Her innovations would improve ship designs throughout the Empire. But more importantly, her example would inspire changes in how the Korthani treated the species they conquered. The little human girl who had crawled through tunnels, fixing broken machines, had become something much greater. She had become a bridge between two different kinds of beings, showing that intelligence and compassion could overcome hatred and fear, and it all started because she chose to do the right thing, even when no one was watching.